The music classroom fell into a deadly silence as Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the air like a blade. Every student froze their eyes, darting between the teacher at the front of the room and 12-year-old Elijah Brooks, who sat perfectly still in the third row, his essay clutched in trembling hands. A Grammy-nominated concert pianist, Mrs. Henderson repeated her voice, dripping with disbelief and condescension. "That's what you're claiming your father is." Mr. Brooks Elijah's throat tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. My dad is Malcolm Brooks. He's performed at Lincoln Center and Kennedy Center. He's been nominated for a Grammy 3 times. A few students snickered. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed behind her reading glasses as she held up Elijah's paper like evidence in a courtroom. "Class, this is exactly what I've been talking about," she announced, her tone sharp and mocking. The difference between creative writing and factual reporting. This assignment was to write about real musical inspiration in your family, not to fabricate elaborate fantasies. "It's not a fantasy," Elijah said quietly, his dark eyes meeting hers without wavering. "It's the truth." Mrs. Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line. She'd been teaching music at Riverside Middle School for 17 years, and she thought she'd seen every excuse, every exaggeration, every tall tale students could conjure. But this, she decided, was too much. "Young man, I've had quite enough of this nonsense," she said coldly. "Do you really expect this class to believe that you, living in the Cedar Grove apartments, taking the bus to school every day, somehow have a father who's a world-renowned pianist? Where exactly is this famous father of yours? Why isn't he here showing off his talent at our little school?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elijah felt his chest constrict, felt the familiar sting of tears threatening behind his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He'd learned from his father that dignity wasn't about never feeling hurt. It was about not letting that hurt define you. "He's on tour," Elijah answered, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly through the silent room. "He travels a lot. That's why I live with my grandparents during the school year." Mrs. Henderson shook her head slowly, a gesture of theatrical disappointment that made several students look away uncomfortably. "I see," she said. "How very convenient. An absent father, unprovable claims, and a story designed to make you seem special. Well, Mr. Brooks, in my classroom, we value honesty above all else, and right now you are being dishonest." The word hit Elijah like a physical blow. Dishonest. Liar. The unspoken accusation filled every corner of the room. What happened next would change everything. But first, we need to understand how this moment came to be, and why a 12-year-old boy found himself standing alone against an adult who refused to believe the truth. The day had started so differently, so full of hope. Elijah had woken up that Tuesday morning with excitement buzzing through his veins. It was the first day of Arts Appreciation Week at Riverside Middle School, an annual tradition that brought music, theater, and visual arts to the forefront of student life. For most kids, it was a welcome break from regular classes. For Elijah, it was so much more. His grandmother had made his favorite breakfast buttermilk pancakes with real maple syrup. As he ate, his phone had buzzed with a text from his father. "Good luck with your essay, son. Tell them the truth, and tell it with pride. I love you." Elijah had smiled, saving the message like he saved all of his father's texts. Malcolm Brooks wasn't home often. The life of a touring concert pianist meant months away performing in different cities and countries, living out of suitcases and hotel rooms. But when they talked, when they video called late at night after his father's performances, Elijah felt that connection as strongly as if they were in the same room. His father had taught him piano since he was 4 years old. Even now, touring the world, Malcolm would send videos demonstrating techniques, would listen to Elijah's recordings, and offer gentle guidance. Music wasn't just something they shared. It was the language of their relationship, the thread that kept them connected across all those miles. On the bus ride to school, Elijah had reviewed his essay one more time. Mrs. Henderson had given the assignment the previous week: write 3 pages about musical inspiration in your family. Most students had written about parents who liked country music, or grandparents who sang in church choirs, or older siblings in garage bands. Elijah had written about his father. He'd described watching Malcolm perform when he was 7 years old, sitting in the audience at a concert hall in Chicago, seeing his father's hands move across the keys, like magic, watching 1,000 people rise to their feet in applause. He'd written about the first time his father taught him Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, how they'd worked on it together for 6 months until Elijah could play it from memory. He'd written about the Grammy nominations, about the international tours, about the photographs on his grandmother's wall, showing Malcolm shaking hands with famous conductors and performing for sold-out audiences. He'd written it all with pride and love, never imagining it would be met with anything but belief. Mrs. Henderson had collected the essays at the start of class. "I'm going to read some of these aloud," she'd announced, "to share the wonderful diversity of musical backgrounds you all come from." She'd read 3 essays first. Sarah Martinez's piece about her uncle's mariachi band, Deshaun Williams's story about his mother who sang gospel music, Emma Carson's memory of her grandfather teaching her guitar chords. Then Mrs. Henderson had picked up Elijah's essay. Her expression had changed as she read it silently to herself. Her eyebrows had risen. Her mouth had twisted into something between a smirk and a frown. And when she'd looked up at Elijah, he'd seen it immediately in her eyes. She didn't believe him. Class, she'd said, her voice taking on that particular tone that teachers use when they're about to make an example of someone. "Let's discuss the importance of truthfulness in writing." That's when she'd started reading his essay aloud, her voice mocking her emphasis on certain words, making them sound absurd. Grammy-nominated, Lincoln Center, international tours. With each phrase, she'd made it sound more ridiculous, more impossible. And that's how Elijah had found himself standing accused of lying in front of 28 of his peers about the father he loved and admired more than anyone in the world. The father who was, in fact, exactly who Elijah had claimed him to be. Mrs. Henderson placed Elijah's essay on her desk with deliberate care, like she was handling evidence of a crime. The fluorescent lights hummed above the classroom, the only sound in the heavy silence. "Mr. Brooks," she continued, her voice taking on the tone of forced patience, "I want to give you an opportunity to be honest, to admit that perhaps you got a little carried away with this assignment. Perhaps you embellished some details about your family situation." Elijah felt his classmates' eyes boring into him from every direction. Some looked curious, others looked embarrassed for him. A few, like Brandon Mitchell in the back row, looked openly amused, barely suppressing laughter. "I didn't embellish anything," Elijah said, forcing himself to keep his voice level. "Everything I wrote is true. My father is Malcolm Brooks. You can look him up online. There are videos of his performances. There are articles about him. It's all real." Mrs. Henderson sighed heavily, as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "Young man, I have been teaching for 17 years. I've seen students from all walks of life come through this classroom. I know the Cedar Grove apartments. I know the neighborhood you come from. And I'm telling you, this story simply doesn't add up." The implication hung in the air, ugly and clear. She was judging him based on where he lived, what he looked like, the zip code on his address. In her mind, A black kid from Cedar Grove couldn't possibly have a father who was a celebrated classical pianist. The two realities didn't fit her worldview, so she'd decided one of them must be false. Just because I live in Cedar Grove doesn't mean my dad can't be successful, Elijah said, a slight edge creeping into his voice, despite his best efforts to stay calm. He grew up there too. He worked hard and became a professional musician. That's what happened. A few students exchanged glances. Ashley Chen, who sat near Elijah, whispered to her neighbor, "Maybe he is telling the truth." Mrs. Henderson's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by 12-year-old students who she'd already decided were being dishonest. "Enough," she said sharply. "Class, this is an important lesson. In the professional music world and classical performance, there are certain pathways, certain credentials, certain backgrounds that lead to success. Concert pianists don't just appear out of nowhere. They train at prestigious conservatories. They come from families with resources. They have connections." Elijah felt anger flare in his chest, hot and sudden. "My dad went to Juilliard," he said, his voice stronger now. "He got a full scholarship because he was that good. He didn't need connections. He had talent." Juilliard Mrs. Henderson repeated her skepticism clear. "Of course. And I suppose he studied under some famous maestro as well. He studied under Professor Chen Wei and Dr. Margaret Thornton." Elijah rattled off his memory sharp from years of hearing his father's stories. He graduated with honors in 2006. He won the Young Concert Artists International auditions in 2008. His debut album was called Nocturnes and Reveries. He's recorded 4 albums total. He's performed with the New York Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and the Los Angeles Philharmonic. The specificity of the details gave a few more students pause. That was an awful lot of information for someone who was supposedly making everything up. But Mrs. Henderson had committed to her position now, and like many adults who find themselves publicly contradicted by a child, she doubled down instead of reconsidering. "My, what an elaborate story," she said coldly. "You've certainly put thought into this fiction. I suppose you've been planning this lie for some time." "It's not a lie." Elijah's voice rose, frustration finally breaking through his careful composure. "Why won't you believe me? Why won't you just look him up? It would take 2 seconds on your phone to see I'm telling the truth." "Do not raise your voice to me, Mr. Brooks," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "Your behavior right now is only making this situation worse. Not only are you lying, but now you're being disrespectful as well." Several students shifted uncomfortably. Even those who'd initially found the situation amusing were starting to feel that something wasn't right. The teacher's refusal to even consider checking Elijah's claims seemed strange, stubborn, unfair. Marcus Johnson, one of Elijah's friends from the basketball team, raised his hand tentatively. "Mrs. Henderson, maybe we could just—" "Put your hand down, Mr. Johnson," the teacher cut him off. "This doesn't concern you." But it did concern him. It concerned all of them. They were watching a classmate be humiliated and called a liar, and their teacher refused to take even the smallest step to verify what he was saying. Elijah felt his hands shaking. He pressed them flat against his desk, trying to steady himself. His father's words echoed in his mind. Tell them the truth, and tell it with pride. He'd told the truth, and it hadn't mattered. "Mrs. Henderson." Elijah said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "I'm not lying. I love my dad. I'm proud of my dad. Everything I wrote in that essay is real, and I don't understand why you won't even give me a chance to prove it." For just a moment, something flickered across the teacher's face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or maybe a hint of recognition that she might be going too far. But then her expression hardened again. "Mr. Brooks, you will stay after class," she announced. we'll be discussing your punishment for this dishonesty. And you'll be writing a new essay, a truthful one this time, about your actual family circumstances. Is that clear? But is that clear? Elijah's shoulders sagged slightly. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Henderson turned back to the rest of the class, ready to move on to the actual lesson she'd planned. But the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. What should have been an inspiring week, celebrating the arts, had begun with an ugly accusation, a stubborn refusal to believe, and a young boy's dignity under fire. And though no one in that classroom knew it yet, the truth was already in motion, traveling toward them like a gathering storm. The rest of the music class passed in a blur of tension. Mrs. Henderson lectured about the history of classical music, occasionally throwing pointed looks in Elijah's direction, as if to emphasize her lesson about authenticity and truth. Elijah sat frozen at his desk. His essay still crumpled in his hands, feeling the weight of his classmates' stares. When the bell finally rang, students gathered their belongings and filed toward the door, many casting sympathetic glances back at Elijah. A few stopped by his desk. "Man, that was harsh," Marcus whispered. "You okay?" Elijah managed a small nod. "Yeah. For what it's worth, I believe you," Ashley said quietly as she passed. "Mr. Brooks, you'll remain seated," Mrs. Henderson called from her desk, where she was organizing papers with sharp, efficient movements. The classroom emptied until it was just the two of them. The silence felt different now, heavier, more oppressive. Elijah watched as Mrs. Henderson stood and walked around to the front of her desk, crossing her arms as she looked down at him. "I want you to understand something," she began, her voice softer now, but no less stern. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to teach you an important life lesson. Lying, especially elaborate lying, will only hurt you in the long run. It's better to accept your circumstances, to be honest about who you are and where you come from, than to create these fantasies." Elijah looked up at her, his dark eyes steady despite the anger and hurt churning inside him. "But I'm not lying, Mrs. Henderson. I don't know how else to say it. My father really is Malcolm Brooks, the pianist. This isn't a fantasy. It's my life." Mrs. Henderson sighed, shaking her head. "Elijah, listen to yourself. Do you know how unlikely that sounds? A world-famous concert pianist and his son is here at Riverside Middle School, living in Cedar Grove. If your father was really who you claim he is, you'd be at a private school studying music intensively, not taking basic music appreciation with me. My dad wanted me to have a normal childhood." Elijah explained, his voice becoming more desperate as he tried to make her understand. "He grew up in this neighborhood. My grandparents still live here. He didn't want me to grow up in hotels and concert halls. He wanted me to have friends and play basketball and just be a regular kid. That's why I live with my grandparents during the school year." How convenient, Mrs. Henderson said, her skepticism undiminished. An explanation for everything. "Because it's true." Elijah's voice cracked slightly. "Mrs. Henderson, please, just look him up. Look up Malcolm Brooks, pianist. You'll see his website. You'll see videos. You'll see everything. I'm begging you to just check." For a long moment, Mrs. Henderson studied him. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Elijah felt a surge of hope. Finally, she was going to look. She was going to see. But instead of searching, Mrs. Henderson held the phone up as if to make a point. "You know what I think? I think perhaps there is a Malcolm Brooks who's a pianist somewhere, and I think maybe you saw his name online or heard about him somehow, and decided to appropriate his identity for your little story. That's even worse than simple lying, Elijah. That's deception with planning." The hope drained out of him like water through a sieve. She wasn't going to look. She'd already made up her mind, and nothing he said would change it. I'm calling your grandmother, Mrs. Henderson continued, setting her phone down on the desk. I'll be speaking with the principal about your punishment. At minimum, you'll be serving detention for the rest of the week. You'll also be removed from participating in any Arts Week activities, and you'll be writing a new essay, a truthful one, which you'll present to the class as an apology for wasting everyone's time with your fabrications. Each word hit Elijah like a hammer blow. Detention. Removal from Arts Week. The 1 week all year he looked forward to most. A public apology for telling the truth. That's not fair, he said quietly. Life isn't fair, Mr. Brooks, Mrs. Henderson replied. The sooner you learn that, the better. Now you're dismissed. Report to detention after school today. Elijah stood slowly, gathering his backpack with mechanical movements. As he walked toward the door, Mrs. Henderson called after him. Elijah, I hope you'll take this as an opportunity for growth. Honesty is always the best policy. Always. He paused at the doorway, his hand on the frame. For a moment he considered turning around, considered trying one more time to make her believe him. But what would be the point? She'd decided who he was, what his life must be like, based on nothing but her own assumptions and prejudices. Yes, ma'am, he said flatly, and walked out into the hallway. The corridor was crowded with students moving between classes, their voices creating a wall of noise that Elijah moved through like he was underwater. He barely heard them. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his grandmother. How's your day going, baby? Did you turn in your essay? Elijah stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the screen. How could he explain this? How could he tell his grandmother that he'd been called a liar for being proud of his father? That his teacher had humiliated him in front of the entire class and refused to even check if he was telling the truth. He typed back. Fine. Essay went okay. Another text came through, this one from his father. How did it go? I bet Mrs. Henderson loved hearing about your old man. Elijah felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. He couldn't tell his father either. Malcolm Brooks had worked so hard to build his career to become someone respected in the classical music world, to break through barriers and prove that talent and dedication mattered more than background or expectations. And now his son was being punished for being proud of him. It went good, Dad, Elijah typed back. She really liked it. The lies tasted bitter even through text message. But what choice did he have? By lunchtime, word had spread through the school. Elijah could hear the whispers as he walked through the cafeteria. Some students pointed. Others looked away uncomfortably. He found Marcus and a few other friends at their usual table. Dude, everyone's talking about music class, Marcus said, as Elijah sat down. Is it true Henderson called you a liar in front of everyone? Yeah, Elijah said quietly, pushing his food around his tray without eating. That's messed up, said Jordan Peters, another friend. Why wouldn't she just look up your dad if you're saying he's famous? I don't know, Elijah admitted. She just decided I was lying, and nothing I said mattered. Well, is your dad really a famous pianist? Jordan asked, not unkindly, just curious. Elijah looked up, meeting his friend's eyes. Yes, he really is. Marcus pulled out his phone. What's his name again? Malcolm Brooks. You don't have to. Elijah started, but Marcus was already typing. Holy crap, Marcus breathed, staring at his screen. Dude, your dad has a Wikipedia page. Jordan leaned over to look. No way. Let me see. Within seconds, both of them were scrolling through search results, their eyes getting wider. Marcus pulled up a video of Malcolm Brooks performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, with a full orchestra, the camera capturing his powerful, expressive performance. Elijah Marcus said slowly, looking up from his phone with something like awe in his voice. "Your dad is incredible." "I know," Elijah said simply. "Henderson is going to feel so stupid when she finds out," Jordan added. But Elijah wasn't so sure. In his experience, adults didn't like admitting when they were wrong, especially not to kids. Mrs. Henderson had made her judgment, and he had a sinking feeling that even proof wouldn't change her mind at this point. She'd find some other reason to justify her position, some other explanation that let her save face. What Elijah didn't know was that the truth has a way of coming out regardless of who wants to suppress it. And in this case, the truth was already on its way, scheduled to arrive at Riverside Middle School in just a few days' time. Detention at Riverside Middle School was held in room 114, a windowless space in the basement that smelled like old textbooks and floor wax. Elijah had never been here before. He'd never needed to be. He got good grades, turned in his assignments on time, and stayed out of trouble. Until today. Mrs. Chen, the detention supervisor, looked surprised when Elijah walked in after school. "Brooks, what are you doing here? I'm supposed to report for detention," Elijah said quietly, handing her the slip Mrs. Henderson had filled out. Mrs. Chen read it, her eyebrows rising. "Dishonesty and disrespect. That doesn't sound like you." "No, ma'am," Elijah agreed, because what else could he say? There were 4 other students in detention, none of whom Elijah knew well. They looked up briefly when he entered, then returned to their phones or homework with disinterest. Elijah took a seat at a desk in the back corner and pulled out his books, but he couldn't focus on the pages in front of him. His mind kept replaying the morning's events. Mrs. Henderson's mocking tone, the snickers from his classmates, the complete refusal to even consider that he might be telling the truth. It felt like being trapped in a nightmare where nothing he said or did mattered. The worst part was knowing his grandmother would find out. Mrs. Henderson had promised to call, and she was the type to follow through on threats. By the time Elijah got home, his grandmother would have already heard some version of the story filtered through Mrs. Henderson's perspective that painted Elijah as a liar and a troublemaker. 45 minutes into detention, Mrs. Chen's phone rang. She answered, listened, then glanced at Elijah. "Brooks, you're wanted in Principal Morrison's office." The other detention students looked up with interest. Getting called to the principal's office during detention was rare, usually meaning something serious was happening. Elijah gathered his things and followed Mrs. Chen down the hallway to the administrative wing. His heart pounded. Was this about his grandmother? Had Mrs. Henderson already called her? Was he in even more trouble now? Principal Morrison's secretary waved him through to the inner office. Principal Morrison was a tall woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a reputation for being fair but firm. She gestured for Elijah to sit. "Mr. Brooks," she began. "I've been speaking with Mrs. Henderson about the incident in music class this morning." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She tells me you were dishonest about your family background in an essay assignment, that you claimed your father was a famous concert pianist, and when confronted you became disrespectful." Elijah felt his chest tighten. Of course, that's how Mrs. Henderson had framed it. "Principal Morrison, I wasn't dishonest. Everything I wrote was true. My father really is Malcolm Brooks, and he really is a concert pianist. I can prove it. There are videos, online articles, his website." Principal Morrison held up a hand. "Elijah, I've also spoken with your grandmother." Elijah's stomach dropped. So it had already happened. His grandmother knew or thought she knew that he'd been lying and causing trouble at school. She was quite confused by Mrs. Henderson's call. Principal Morrison continued. "In fact, she told me something interesting. She said that your father is indeed Malcolm Brooks, the pianist. She mentioned that he's actually scheduled to perform at our Arts Week concert on Friday evening. Elijah's head snapped up. What Principal Morrison pulled out a folder from her desk drawer. I did some checking after speaking with your grandmother. It seems that 3 months ago, our Parent-Teacher Arts Committee reached out to several local musicians to participate in Arts Week. One of the musicians who agreed was Malcolm Brooks. The committee coordinated with his management team, and he's been scheduled as our guest performer for Friday night's concert. She opened the folder showing Elijah official correspondence between the school and his father's booking agent. There it was in black and white. Malcolm Brooks would be performing at Riverside Middle School as part of Arts Appreciation Week. Your grandmother mentioned that you probably didn't know about this arrangement because your father wanted it to be a surprise, Principal Morrison said. He was planning to surprise you at the concert. Elijah felt like the floor had tilted beneath him. His father was coming. His father had been scheduled to come all along to perform at his school, and he'd kept it secret to surprise him. And now that surprise had been ruined, but more importantly, it meant vindication was coming. Proof was coming. Mrs. Henderson would have to face the truth. Does Mrs. Henderson know? Elijah asked. Principal Morrison's expression became carefully neutral. She does now. I just informed her before calling you in. I wanted to apologize to you personally, Elijah. You were treated unfairly today. You told the truth, and you were not believed. That should never happen to a student in this building. The apology felt surreal. Adults rarely apologized to kids, especially not principals to students. But even through his relief, Elijah felt a deep sadness. Why had it taken all of this? Why hadn't Mrs. Henderson just believed him? Why hadn't she taken 30 seconds to search his father's name and verify what he was saying? Thank you, Principal Morrison, Elijah said quietly. You're excused from detention, of course, she continued. And I'll be speaking with Mrs. Henderson about her handling of this situation. What happened today was not acceptable. Elijah nodded, but he felt oddly hollow. Yes, the truth was coming out. Yes, he would be vindicated. But the damage had already been done. His classmates had seen him humiliated. He'd been called a liar in front of everyone. And no apology could completely erase that feeling of being judged, dismissed, and refused belief simply because someone had decided who he must be based on where he came from. Can I go home? Elijah asked. Of course. I've already called your grandmother to let her know you're coming. Elijah walked out of the principal's office in a daze. The hallways were mostly empty now after school activities, having moved to gyms and auditoriums. He made his way to the front entrance, pushing through the heavy doors into the late afternoon sunshine. His grandmother's old Buick was already waiting in the pickup lane. Elijah climbed into the passenger seat, and before he could say anything, his grandmother pulled him into a tight hug. Baby, I'm so sorry, she said. I'm so sorry that teacher treated you that way. Elijah felt the tears he'd been holding back all day finally break free. He cried into his grandmother's shoulder while she held him, rubbing his back and murmuring comforting words. It's okay, baby. It's okay. Your daddy's going to be so proud of how you handled yourself. You told the truth even when it was hard, even when nobody believed you. That takes real strength. Why didn't she believe me? Grandma Elijah asked through his tears. Why wouldn't she even look? His grandmother pulled back, cupping his face in her hands and wiping his tears with her thumbs. Sometimes people make up their minds about who we are based on what they think they know. They see where we live or how we look, and they decide that's all we can be. Your daddy dealt with that his whole life, baby. He dealt with people who thought a black boy from Cedar Grove couldn't become a classical pianist. He proved them all wrong. And you know what? You proved that teacher wrong too. But she's going to find out on Friday, Elijah said, when Dad performs. Everyone's going to know she was wrong. Yes, they will. His grandmother agreed, and that's going to be hard for her. But that's her burden to carry, not yours. You just keep being who you are, a smart, honest, talented young man who loves his father and tells the truth. That's all anyone can ask of you. They drove home through familiar streets, past the community center where Elijah played basketball, past the corner store where his grandfather bought his newspaper every morning, past the apartment complex where Elijah had lived his entire life. Cedar Grove wasn't fancy. The buildings were old, the streets were cracked, and most families here worked hard just to make ends meet. But it was home. It was real. And it had produced Malcolm Brooks, who had risen from these same streets to perform on some of the world's most prestigious stages. Mrs. Henderson had judged this neighborhood, had judged Elijah, had decided that excellence couldn't emerge from these circumstances. She'd been wrong. And in 3 days, the entire school would know just how wrong she'd been. By Wednesday morning, Riverside Middle School was buzzing with a new energy. Word had spread quickly through the intricate network of middle school gossip. Elijah Brooks had been telling the truth. His father really was a famous pianist. And more than that, he was coming to perform at Friday's Arts Week concert. Elijah arrived at school to find the atmosphere around him completely changed. Students who had laughed or looked away yesterday now approached him in the hallways. "Yo, Elijah, is it true? Your dad's performing Friday?" asked Brandon Mitchell, the same kid who'd been snickering in music class. "Yeah," Elijah confirmed simply. "That's so cool, man. Can you introduce me?" Elijah just shrugged and kept walking. The sudden friendliness felt hollow, almost as fake as the mockery had been. In first period English, Ashley Chen turned around in her seat to talk to him before class started. "I looked up your dad last night. His performance of Chopin's Nocturnes is amazing. Does he teach you?" "Sometimes," Elijah said. "When he's home? That must be incredible having someone that talented as your dad." It was incredible, Elijah wanted to say. But yesterday you all watched me get humiliated and hardly anyone said anything. Where was this enthusiasm then? Marcus found him. Before second period, his phone in hand. "Dude, check this out. I posted about your dad on my Instagram last night and it's got like 200 likes. Everyone's talking about it." Elijah looked at the post, a video of Malcolm Brooks performing with Marcus's caption, "My friend's dad is literally a Grammy-nominated concert pianist and nobody believed him. Mrs. Henderson owes him a massive apology." The comments were full of reactions, shocked emojis, supportive messages, and quite a few critical remarks about Mrs. Henderson's handling of the situation. "Marcus, you didn't have to do that," Elijah said. "Yeah, I did. What she did was wrong and people should know it." By lunchtime, the cafeteria was divided into clear camps. Some students like Marcus and Ashley were firmly on Elijah's side, angry about how he'd been treated and excited about Friday's performance. Others were uncomfortable with the drama, staying quiet and trying to avoid taking sides. And a small group, mainly friends of students whose parents knew Mrs. Henderson, were defensive of the teacher, arguing that she'd just been doing her job, that Elijah's story had sounded unbelievable. Elijah sat with his usual group, but the conversation felt strained. Everyone wanted to talk about his father, about the upcoming performance, about what Mrs. Henderson must be feeling now. "She's probably freaking out," Jordan said. "My mom's on the arts committee and she said Henderson just found out yesterday that Malcolm Brooks is actually your dad. She had no idea he was scheduled to perform." "Wait, really?" Marcus looked shocked. So she could have just checked the Arts Week schedule and seen his name. I guess the committee kept the performer names kind of secret, until they could confirm everyone, Jordan explained. They wanted to announce them all at once. But yeah, if Henderson had bothered to look at the list, she would have seen your dad's name right there. The irony was bitter. Mrs. Henderson could have verified Elijah's story multiple ways, but she'd been so convinced he was lying that she'd never even tried. "What's she been like in class?" Ashley asked. "Anyone had her yet today?" "I have her 4th period," said a girl named Jessica from the next table over. She'd been listening to their conversation. She seemed really tense. She didn't mention Elijah or anything, but you could tell something was bothering her. "Good," Marcus said firmly. "She should feel bad." But Elijah felt conflicted. Yes, Mrs. Henderson had been wrong. Yes, she'd humiliated him unfairly. But he'd been raised to respect his elders, to give people grace, to understand that everyone makes mistakes. The vindictive satisfaction that some of his classmates were expressing didn't sit right with him. "She made a mistake," Elijah said quietly. "A bad one. But I don't want everyone to hate her or anything." Marcus looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "Elijah, she called you a liar in front of the whole class. She gave you detention. She refused to even check if you were telling the truth. Why are you defending her?" "I'm not defending what she did," Elijah clarified. "I'm just saying she's still a person. My dad always tells me that holding on to anger only hurts yourself. Mrs. Henderson was wrong, and she'll have to deal with the consequences of that. But I don't have to be angry about it forever." His friends exchanged glances, a mixture of admiration and confusion on their faces. Most 12-year-olds, when vindicated after being wrongly accused, would want revenge, would want to see their accuser suffer. But Elijah had been raised by Malcolm Brooks, who had faced prejudice and doubt throughout his career, and had learned to respond with dignity rather than bitterness. The afternoon brought music class, the first time Elijah would face Mrs. Henderson since the truth had come out. He walked into the classroom with his heart pounding, unsure what to expect. Mrs. Henderson stood at her desk, her posture rigid, her face carefully composed into an expression of professional neutrality. When Elijah entered, their eyes met briefly, and he saw something flash across her face, shame, perhaps, or regret before she looked away. The class filled up an unusual tension in the air as students took their seats. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen, how Mrs. Henderson would address the elephant in the room. She didn't. Instead, she launched into the day's lesson on musical notation, her voice steady but lacking its usual confidence. She didn't mention Monday's incident. She didn't mention Arts Week. She didn't mention Malcolm Brooks or Elijah's essay. She simply taught, as if nothing had happened. Elijah sat through the class in a state of surreal disbelief. Was she really going to pretend nothing had occurred? Was there going to be no acknowledgement, no apology, no recognition that she'd been catastrophically wrong? Apparently not. The bell rang, and Mrs. Henderson dismissed the class without ever meeting Elijah's eyes. As students filed out, Ashley lingered near Elijah's desk. That was weird, right? She didn't say anything. Yeah, Elijah agreed quietly. Do you think she'll apologize before Friday? Elijah gathered his books slowly. I don't know. What he did know was that Friday was coming, ready or not. His father would perform in front of the entire school community, and Mrs. Henderson would have to face the living proof that she'd been wrong. And Elijah would have to navigate whatever came next, armed with nothing but the truth he'd been telling all along, and the dignity his father had taught him to maintain no matter what. Thursday afternoon, the school was transformed. Colorful banners hung in the hallways, announcing Arts Appreciation Week. Student artwork lined the walls of the main corridor. The drama club was setting up for their showcase in the auditorium. And in the music wing, preparations were underway for Friday night's concert, the grand finale of the week's celebrations. Elijah walked past the music room after school and saw Mrs. Henderson inside organizing sheet music and coordinating with other teachers. The Parent-Teacher Arts Committee had been working for months to make this week special, and Mrs. Henderson, as the music teacher, was central to the planning. He wondered what she was thinking. Was she dreading Friday? Was she anxious about facing his father? Or had she convinced herself that she'd been justified in her skepticism, that the unusual circumstances somehow excused her refusal to believe him? In the auditorium, workers were setting up chairs and testing sound equipment. The concert would feature several student performances, the school band, a choir ensemble, some solo acts with Malcolm Brooks as the featured guest performer. It was meant to be the highlight of Arts Week, a chance for students to see professional musicianship up close. Now it would be something else entirely, a public reckoning. Elijah's phone buzzed with a text from his father landing tomorrow at 2 p.m. "Can't wait to see you, son, and can't wait to meet your classmates and teachers." There was a subtle emphasis in that last sentence that made Elijah smile despite his nervousness. His grandmother had told Malcolm everything, of course. His father knew what had happened, knew how Elijah had been treated. Malcolm Brooks was a gentleman, slow to anger and quick to forgive, but he was also fiercely protective of his son. "Can't wait to see you too, Dad," Elijah texted back. That evening at home, Elijah sat at the upright piano in his grandparents' living room. It was old and slightly out of tune, but it was where he'd learned to play, where his father had first taught him to read music and understand rhythm and feel the emotion behind the notes. He played through some of his favorite pieces, a Chopin waltz, a section of Beethoven's Pathétique Sonata, a modern piece his father had composed and taught him over video call. The music settled something in him the same way it always had. At the piano, the world made sense. At the piano, there was only the truth of the notes, the honesty of the melody. His grandfather came to stand in the doorway listening. When Elijah finished, the old man clapped slowly. "Your daddy's gift," he said with a smile. "But your own heart, that's what makes it special." "Grandpa, do you think Mrs. Henderson will apologize tomorrow?" His grandfather considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. "Maybe. Maybe not. Some people find it hard to admit when they're wrong, especially to someone younger than them. But what matters isn't whether she apologizes. What matters is that you know you did right. You told the truth. You stood up for yourself with dignity. That's what counts." "It just feels bad," Elijah admitted. "Even though everyone knows I was telling the truth now, it still feels bad that she didn't believe me." "I know, son. Your daddy felt that way many times growing up. People saw a black boy from this neighborhood and decided he couldn't be a serious classical musician. Some teachers discouraged him. Some people at auditions treated him like he didn't belong. But he kept playing, kept working, kept proving them wrong, not because he was angry, but because he loved the music too much to let anyone take it from him." Elijah nodded slowly, understanding the parallel. His father had faced a lifetime of Mrs. Henderson's people who judged before listening, who saw background before talent, who let their assumptions overrule evidence. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," his grandmother said, joining them in the living room with 3 glasses of sweet tea. "Half the school's going to be there. The arts committee invited parents and community members too. It's going to be packed. Your father handles audiences of thousands," his grandfather added. "Tomorrow night will be no different for him. Just another performance." But it wouldn't be just another performance, and everyone knew it. It would be vindication. It would be proof. It would be the moment when everyone who had doubted Elijah would have to confront the reality they'd dismissed. Friday morning arrived with nervous energy crackling through the school. The concert was scheduled for 7 o'clock that evening, but excitement and anticipation filled the hallways throughout the day. Students who had signed up to perform were excused from afternoon classes for rehearsal. Elijah wasn't performing Mrs. Henderson had excluded him from Arts Week activities as part of his punishment, but he had permission to attend the evening concert. In music class, the last period before the concert, Mrs. Henderson addressed the students briefly. "I know many of you are excited about tonight's performance. We're very fortunate to have such talented guest artists joining us. I expect everyone to be on their best behavior to show respect for the performers and to represent Riverside Middle School well." She still didn't mention Malcolm Brooks by name. Still didn't look at Elijah. After class, as students flooded out into the hallway, chattering about the evening ahead, Mrs. Henderson called out, "Mr. Brooks, a moment, please." Elijah's heart jumped. This was it. She was going to apologize. She had to. He approached her desk slowly. Mrs. Henderson stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression carefully controlled. "Yes, ma'am." For a long moment, she didn't speak. "Then I understand your father will be performing tonight." "Yes, ma'am. I want you to know that I take my responsibilities as an educator very seriously. Sometimes in the classroom situations arise that require immediate judgment calls. I made the call I thought was appropriate at the time based on the information I had." Elijah waited for the apology that should come next. But it didn't come. "I expect this evening to proceed professionally," Mrs. Henderson continued. "I hope there won't be any unnecessary drama or attention drawn to our earlier misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. That's what she was calling it. Not my mistake or my misjudgment. A misunderstanding as if they'd both been somehow at fault." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah said quietly, disappointment heavy in his chest. "You're dismissed." Elijah left the classroom feeling hollow. She hadn't apologized. She'd framed the situation as a mutual misunderstanding rather than her refusing to believe him. She was already trying to save face to minimize her role in what had happened. But tonight, none of that would matter. Tonight, the truth would speak for itself. The autumn sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Malcolm Brooks's rental car pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Middle School. From the back seat, Elijah watched his father survey the building where his son spent his days, a small smile playing at the corners of Malcolm's mouth. "Not much different from when I went to school around here," Malcolm observed. "They've added some new buildings, but the bones are the same." Elijah's grandmother, who had driven them, parked near the main entrance. It was 5:30 minutes before the concert was scheduled to begin. Early enough for Malcolm to check the sound equipment, meet with the organizers, and prepare for his performance. Early enough that most attendees hadn't arrived yet, but not early enough to avoid attention entirely. As they climbed out of the car, a few early arriving parents and teachers noticed them. Malcolm Brooks was hard to miss. At 6 feet tall, with an elegant bearing and the natural confidence of someone accustomed to performing for thousands, he drew eyes even in casual clothes. He wore dark slacks and a simple button-down shirt now, but he carried a garment bag that held his performance attire. Dad, Elijah said quietly as they walked toward the entrance. "Mrs. Henderson doesn't know you're my dad." Malcolm glanced down at his son, his expression unreadable. "She knows now, Elijah. Principal Morrison called my management team and explained the situation. I'm sure Mrs. Henderson has been informed. She never apologized," Elijah admitted. "She just called it a misunderstanding." Malcolm stopped walking, crouching down to meet his son at eye level despite the fact that Elijah was nearly as tall as some adults now. "Listen to me. What happened to you this week was wrong. You were judged based on assumptions and prejudices, and that's never acceptable. But here's what I want you to remember. You told the truth, even when it was hard. You maintained your dignity, even when you were being humiliated. You stood firm even when authority figures were pressuring you to recant. That's strength, son. That's character. And no apology or lack thereof can take that away from you." Elijah nodded, feeling tears prick at his eyes. "I'm really glad you're here, Dad." "Me too, son. Me too." They continued into the building where Principal Morrison was waiting in the main office. Her face brightened when she saw them. "Mr. Brooks, welcome to Riverside Middle School. We're so honored to have you performing tonight. Thank you for inviting me, Principal Morrison. Though I understand the circumstances have become somewhat complicated." Principal Morrison's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, well, we've addressed the situation internally. I want to assure you that Elijah was treated unfairly, and steps have been taken to ensure it doesn't happen again. I'd like to speak with Mrs. Henderson before the performance if possible," Malcolm said calmly. An awkward pause followed. Principal Morrison cleared her throat. "Of course, she's in the auditorium making final preparations. I'll take you there." They walked through the hallways past lockers decorated with student artwork and banners celebrating various achievements. For Malcolm, it must have been like traveling back in time. These same hallways, or ones just like them, were where he'd walked as a student himself decades ago, when he was a kid from Cedar Grove who dreamed of playing piano professionally. The auditorium doors stood open, revealing a space in transformation. The stage was set with a beautiful grand piano, a Steinway rented specially for the occasion. Sound technicians were running cables and testing microphones. Parent volunteers were setting up refreshment tables in the lobby. And near the stage, directing the arrangement of chairs and stands, stood Mrs. Henderson. She was focused on her clipboard, checking off items on her list, and didn't notice them enter at first. Principal Morrison called out, "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Brooks has arrived." Mrs. Henderson looked up, and Elijah watched as recognition washed over her face. She'd seen photos online, of course. She'd watched videos since learning the truth. But seeing Malcolm Brooks in person in her auditorium, in the school where she'd called his son a liar, was clearly different. The color drained from her face. "Mr. Brooks," she managed her voice tight. "Welcome. We're very pleased to have you performing tonight." Malcolm crossed the auditorium with measured steps, his bearing professional, but his eyes sharp. When he reached Mrs. Henderson, he didn't extend his hand. He simply looked at her, really looked at her in a way that made her shrink back slightly. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that filled the space. "I understand you've met my son." "Yes," she said weakly, dead. "Elijah is in my music class. And I understand there was an incident earlier this week. An incident where Elijah wrote an essay about me, about his pride in his father's career, and you called him a liar in front of his entire class." The auditorium had gone silent. The technicians had stopped working. The parent volunteers had stopped moving. Everyone was watching this moment unfold. Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled slightly. "There was a misunderstanding. You thought what Malcolm's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. You thought that a black child from Cedar Grove couldn't possibly have a father who was a professional musician. You thought that his circumstances defined his truth. You thought that your assumptions were more valid than his lived experience. I didn't mean," Mrs. Henderson started. "My son came to you with pride," Malcolm continued. "He wrote about me with love and admiration. And instead of taking 30 seconds to verify what he was saying, instead of giving him the benefit of the doubt, instead of treating him with the basic respect every student deserves, you humiliated him. You called him dishonest. You punished him, all because you decided without evidence that his truth couldn't possibly be true." Tears were streaming down Mrs. Henderson's face now. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was completely wrong." "You weren't wrong just about me," Malcolm said quietly. "You were wrong about him. My son is honest, talented, hardworking, and kind. Those are truths that have nothing to do with where he lives or what I do for a living. Those are truths about who he is as a person. And you never gave yourself the chance to see that because you'd already decided who he must be. Principal Morrison stepped forward. Mr. Brooks, I assure you that we've taken this situation very seriously, Mrs. Henderson will be undergoing additional training on bias and cultural sensitivity. Malcolm held up a hand. Principal Morrison, I appreciate your efforts, but this isn't about training. This is about basic human decency. It's about seeing a child first before you see their zip code, or their skin color, or their family situation. He turned back to Mrs. Henderson, his expression softening slightly. I've spent my entire career facing people who thought I didn't belong in classical music. People who saw a black man at a piano and assumed I must play jazz or blues, not Rachmaninoff and Chopin. People who questioned my credentials, my training, my legitimacy. I thought maybe things had changed. I thought maybe my son wouldn't have to face the same prejudices I did. I truly am sorry, Mrs. Henderson said again, her voice breaking. There's no excuse for how I treated Elijah. You're right about everything. I made assumptions I had no right to make. I let my biases override my judgment, and I hurt a child in the process. I'm deeply, profoundly sorry. Malcolm looked at her for a long moment, then at Elijah, who stood near the auditorium entrance with his grandmother. The apology I need isn't for me. It's for my son. Mrs. Henderson turned, seeing Elijah properly for the first time since they'd entered. She walked toward him on unsteady legs, her professional composure completely shattered. When she reached him, she knelt down so they were at eye level. Elijah, she said, her voice thick with tears. I owe you an enormous apology. What I did to you was inexcusable. You told me the truth and I didn't believe you. Worse than that, I humiliated you for telling the truth. I made assumptions about you and your family that I had no right to make. I let my own biases and prejudices hurt you, and I am so sorry. Elijah looked at this woman who had caused him so much pain and embarrassment this week. He could see that her remorse was genuine, that she truly understood the magnitude of her mistake. His father's words echoed in his mind: dignity, character, strength. I accept your apology, Elijah said quietly. I hope you'll believe students in the future even when their stories seem unusual. Everyone deserves to be believed until proven otherwise, not the other way around. Mrs. Henderson nodded, wiping at her tears. You're absolutely right. Thank you for your grace, Elijah. You've shown more maturity and kindness than I did. The auditorium remained tense as Mrs. Henderson stood and composed herself, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Other teachers and volunteers had slowly filtered in during the conversation drawn by the charged atmosphere. Now they stood in small clusters, witnesses to an accountability that rarely played out so publicly in educational settings. Principal Morrison cleared her throat. Mr. Brooks, if you'd like to see the piano and check the sound setup we have about an hour before doors open to the public. Malcolm nodded, but didn't immediately move toward the stage. Instead, he looked around the auditorium, taking in the space where his son spent time, where this week's drama had unfolded. Mrs. Henderson, he said, his tone less harsh now, but still serious. May I ask you something? She looked up, her eyes red but attentive. Of course. What made you so certain Elijah was lying? What was it about his story that seemed impossible to you? The question hung in the air. It wasn't accusatory, now it was genuine, an attempt to understand the thinking that had led to such a harmful misjudgment. Mrs. Henderson took a shaky breath. I think I've become cynical. I've taught for 17 years and I've had students exaggerate before tell tall tales to seem more interesting. When Elijah mentioned Grammy nominations and Lincoln Center, it just seemed so far outside the realm of what I expected from students in this neighborhood. She paused, her face crumpling with fresh shame. I'm hearing myself say it, and I'm realizing how terrible that sounds. How prejudiced." "It is prejudiced," Malcolm agreed, but his voice was gentle now, almost professorial. "And the dangerous thing about prejudice is that it feels like pattern recognition. It feels like experience and wisdom. You've taught for 17 years, so when something doesn't fit your established patterns, you dismiss it. But those patterns were built on limited exposure, on societal assumptions, on structural inequalities that make certain paths seem impossible for certain people." He walked slowly toward the stage as he spoke, his movements measured. "I grew up 20 minutes from this school. I played piano on an instrument my mother saved for 2 years to buy. It wasn't a Steinway, it was a beat-up console piano someone was throwing away that my uncle helped us move into our apartment. But I played that piano every single day. I practiced 4, 5, 6 hours a day because I loved it, because it spoke to something in my soul." Malcolm ran his hand along the edge of the grand piano on the stage, his fingers trailing across its polished surface. "When I auditioned for Juilliard, the panel was surprised. One of them actually asked if I was sure I wanted to audition for classical performance, or if I'd rather try the jazz program. I was 17 years old, and I'd just played Liszt's Transcendental Etudes, some of the most difficult piano compositions ever written, and they still couldn't see me as a classical pianist." Elijah watched his father seeing the pain of old wounds resurface, even as Malcolm shared the story with characteristic grace. "So I understand the cynicism," Malcolm continued. "I understand pattern recognition, but here's what I had to learn, and what I hope you'll take from this experience. Mrs. Henderson patterns can be changed. Expectations can be exceeded. And when someone tells you their truth, especially when that truth challenges your assumptions, your first response should be curiosity, not dismissal." Mrs. Henderson nodded, absorbing the lesson. "You're right. Absolutely right. I should have been curious. I should have been excited that one of my students had such an impressive connection to the music world. Instead, I was suspicious and dismissive. I failed Elijah, and I failed my own principles as an educator." Mr. Chen, another music teacher, who had been standing near the back of the auditorium, spoke up. "Malcolm, may I call you Malcolm? What you're describing is something we should all be reflecting on. I think every teacher here has probably made assumptions about students based on their backgrounds. This situation with Elijah is forcing us to examine those assumptions more critically." Several other teachers murmured agreement, an uncomfortable acknowledgement of implicit biases that rarely get named so directly. Malcolm turned to address them. "I don't share my story to make anyone feel guilty. I share it because change only happens when we're honest about the patterns we've perpetuated. Classical music has a diversity problem. It always has. The concert halls, the conservatories, the professional orchestras, they're overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly from certain socioeconomic backgrounds. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because of thousands of small moments like what Elijah experienced this week. Someone with talent and passion being told implicitly or explicitly that they don't belong." He sat down at the piano bench, his posture relaxing slightly. "But here's the beautiful thing about music. It doesn't care about any of that. The piano doesn't know if the hands playing it are black or white, rich or poor, expected or unexpected. The music only cares about feeling and technique and truth." Malcolm played a soft, haunting melody, something Elijah recognized as an original composition his father had written years ago. The notes floated through the auditorium, beautiful and melancholic, silencing all other sound. When he finished, the space remained quiet for several heartbeats. "That was beautiful," Principal Morrison said softly. "Thank you," Malcolm replied. "I wrote it when Elijah was born. It's called Inheritance. Because that's what we pass on to our children, not just our genetics or our circumstances, but our dignity, our resilience, our refusal to let anyone else define our worth. He looked toward where Elijah stood with his grandmother. My son inherited my love of music, but more importantly, he inherited the strength to stand firm in his truth, even when powerful people told him he was wrong. That's the inheritance that matters. Elijah felt his grandmother's hand squeeze his shoulder gently. He felt tears on his cheeks, but didn't wipe them away. This moment, his father defending him, teaching through his pain, transforming a hurtful situation into a learning opportunity, this was who Malcolm Brooks was. Not just a talented pianist, but a man of profound character. Mrs. Henderson approached the stage slowly. Mr. Brooks, I know I've already apologized to Elijah, but I need to apologize to you as well. Not just for doubting his word about you, but for embodying the exact kind of prejudice you've had to fight against your entire career. I'm ashamed of myself, and I promise you I will do better. I will be better. Malcolm stood and finally extended his hand. Mrs. Henderson took it, and they shook a gesture of reconciliation, of moving forward. I believe you will, Malcolm said. And I hope you'll extend that same commitment to believing your students, all of them, especially when their truths challenge your expectations. I will, she promised. Starting tonight, thank you for your grace in this situation. You would have been justified in being far angrier. Anger has its place, Malcolm acknowledged, but transformation is more powerful. If this experience changes how even one teacher sees their students, then something good has come from Elijah's pain. And that matters. The sound technician, who had been waiting patiently through the entire exchange, finally spoke up. Mr. Brooks, whenever you're ready, we should do a sound check. Malcolm nodded. Of course. Let's make sure everything is perfect for tonight's performance. As the technical preparations began, the tension in the auditorium gradually shifted. What had been uncomfortable confrontation had evolved into something more constructive: acknowledgement, accountability, and the possibility of change. Elijah's grandmother leaned down to whisper in his ear. Your father handled that beautifully, firm but kind, honest but graceful. That's the man he is. I know, Grandma, Elijah whispered back. And you handled it beautifully too, she added, accepting her apology with dignity. Not everyone could do that. As Malcolm began his sound check, playing scales and testing dynamics, Elijah felt something shift inside him. The hurt from earlier in the week was still there. That kind of pain doesn't just disappear, but it was transforming into something else, understanding, maybe, or perspective. He'd learned something important about standing firm in truth. He'd learned something about maintaining dignity under pressure. And he'd learned, watching his father navigate this difficult situation, what true strength looked like. It wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about honest communication, about naming harm, while allowing space for growth, about holding people accountable, while also extending grace. The doors would open in 45 minutes. Parents and students and community members would flood in, expecting an evening of music and student performances. They would get that, but they would also get something else. They would witness Malcolm Brooks, the Grammy-nominated concert pianist from Cedar Grove, performing at his son's school, validating everything Elijah had said, proving that excellence can emerge from anywhere, that assumptions are dangerous, and that truth always eventually comes to light. By 7 o'clock, the auditorium was packed. Every seat was filled with overflow attendees, standing along the back wall and in the side aisles. The turnout was unprecedented for a school arts event. Word had spread not just about the talented guest performer, but about the drama that had preceded his arrival. Elijah sat in the third row with his grandmother, surrounded by classmates and their families. Marcus was 2 seats over, giving him a thumbs up. Ashley sat behind him, with her parents. Even students who normally wouldn't attend a classical music performance had shown up drawn by curiosity and the awareness that tonight was about more than just music. Mrs. Henderson stood near the stage, her role as event coordinator requiring her presence despite the emotional ordeal of the afternoon. She'd cleaned herself up, reapplied her makeup, and put on a professional smile, but Elijah could see the lingering strain in her eyes, the weight of her mistake still heavy on her shoulders. Principal Morrison stepped onto the stage to welcome everyone. Good evening, and welcome to our Arts Appreciation Week concert. We have a wonderful lineup of performances tonight from our talented students, and we're especially honored to have a very special guest performer joining us. She paused, letting anticipation build. Our featured artist tonight is Malcolm Brooks, a Grammy-nominated concert pianist who has performed at venues around the world, including Lincoln Center, Kennedy Center, and Carnegie Hall. He's recorded 4 albums of classical piano works, and he's been praised by critics as one of the most expressive and technically brilliant pianists of his generation. Applause rippled through the audience. Principal Morrison waited for it to subside before continuing. But tonight is especially meaningful because Malcolm Brooks isn't just a world-renowned musician. He's also a proud father and a member of our own Riverside community. His son, Elijah Brooks, is a 7th grader here at our school, and we're thrilled to have them both with us tonight. More applause this time, with an undercurrent of murmuring as some audience members made the connection, putting together the pieces of the story they'd heard fragments of throughout the week. We'll begin with some performances from our student musicians, and then Mr. Brooks will close the evening with a special concert. Thank you all for being here. The student performances began. The school band played a medley of pop songs arranged for brass and woodwinds. A choir of 6th graders sang a sweet rendition of a folk song. A few solo performers showcased their individual talents on various instruments. Elijah watched it all, but his mind was partly elsewhere, anticipating the moment when his father would take the stage. He'd seen Malcolm perform dozens of times, but never here, never at his school, never in front of the people who had doubted and dismissed him. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes of student performances, Principal Morrison returned to the microphone. And now the moment many of you have been waiting for. Please join me in welcoming Malcolm Brooks. The applause was thunderous as Malcolm walked onto the stage. He'd changed into his performance attire, an elegant black suit with a crisp white shirt. The kind of sophisticated but understated clothing that let the focus remain on the music rather than the performer. He moved with easy confidence, nodding to the audience as he approached the Steinway grand piano at center stage. He adjusted the bench, sat down, and positioned his hands over the keys. The auditorium fell silent, that special kind of anticipatory quiet that happens before a performance begins. Good evening, Malcolm said, his voice warm and resonant, even without a microphone. Thank you for that wonderful welcome. Before I begin, I want to share a bit about what I'll be playing tonight and why I chose these particular pieces. He rested his hands in his lap, making eye contact with various sections of the audience as he spoke. Classical music has a reputation for being stuffy, inaccessible something for elite audiences in formal settings. But that's never been true. Real music is about emotion, about human experience, about stories we tell without words. His eyes found Elijah in the 3rd row. Tonight's program is dedicated to my son, Elijah, who has had a challenging week. He's shown courage and dignity that would make any father proud. So the pieces I've chosen all speak to themes of resilience, truth, and triumph over adversity. A visible emotion rippled through the audience. Many knew exactly what Malcolm was referring to. I'll begin with Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which is often mistakenly thought of as merely a pretty melancholy piece. But Beethoven wrote it during a time of deep personal struggle as his hearing was beginning to fail. It's a meditation on continuing forward even when circumstances seem insurmountable. Malcolm's hands moved to the keys, and the opening notes filled the auditorium. Immediately, it was clear this wasn't an amateur playing. His touch was both delicate and powerful, drawing out nuances in the familiar melody that most people had never noticed. The slow, haunting first movement seemed to speak directly to the soul each note placed with intentional precision. Elijah had heard his father play this piece 100 times, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, every note seemed to carry additional weight, additional meaning. This was his father's language, the way Malcolm Brooks spoke truths that transcended words. The first movement concluded, and Malcolm moved seamlessly into the more energetic second movement, then into the famous tempestuous third movement, his hands flying across the keys with breathtaking speed and accuracy. The piano sang, cried, shouted, whispered under his touch. When the final chord faded, the audience sat stunned for a moment, before erupting into applause. Malcolm bowed graciously, but didn't stand from the bench. "Thank you," he said, when the applause subsided. "Next, I'll play one of my own compositions. This is called Inheritance, and I wrote it the day my son was born. It's about the gifts we pass down to our children, not material things, but values, strength, identity. The piece that followed was modern, with complex harmonies and rhythms that wove together classical technique with contemporary sensibilities. It was beautiful and challenging, emotional and intellectual at once." Elijah recognized motifs that his father had incorporated from spirituals and blues musical traditions from their own cultural heritage, blended seamlessly with classical European forms. This piece told a story of heritage, of pride, of bridges between past and future. It spoke to the journey of Malcolm's own family, from the struggles of previous generations to the opportunities available now, from Cedar Grove to concert halls around the world. When it ended, there was a moment of profound silence before the applause began. And this time, Elijah could see tears on the faces of many audience members, his grandmother included. Malcolm played two more pieces: Chopin's revolutionary Etude, a piece written in anger and grief, but transformed into something triumphant through virtuosic performance, and finally Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, a piece that explicitly bridged classical and jazz traditions, that celebrated American musical diversity and cultural fusion. By the time Malcolm played the final flourishing notes of the Gershwin, the audience was completely enthralled. The standing ovation was immediate and sustained, people rising to their feet throughout the auditorium, applauding not just for the technical brilliance of the performance, but for everything it represented. Malcolm stood and bowed, then gestured toward Elijah. "I'd like to invite my son to join me on stage." Elijah's eyes went wide. His grandmother gave him a gentle push. "Go on, baby." Heart-pounding, Elijah made his way down the aisle and up the steps to the stage. His father put an arm around his shoulders, facing the audience together. "My son is an accomplished pianist in his own right," Malcolm said. "He's been studying since he was 4 years old, and I thought we might close the evening with a short duet, if you'll indulge us." More applause excited now the audience, eager to see father and son perform together. They sat side by side at the piano, Malcolm on the left, Elijah on the right. Malcolm counted them in quietly, and they began to play a piece they'd practiced together over countless video calls, a simplified arrangement of Debussy's Clair de Lune, arranged for 4 hands at one piano. Elijah's nerves disappeared as soon as his fingers touched the keys. This was what he knew, what he loved, what connected him to his father across all the miles and time apart. Their hands moved in coordination, Malcolm taking the lower registers and more complex passages, Elijah handling the melodic lines and upper harmonies. The piece was tender, beautiful, a conversation between two voices that understood each other perfectly. And when they played the final gentle chord together, letting it fade slowly into silence, there wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes. Elijah and Malcolm stood and bowed together, and Elijah saw Mrs. Henderson in the wings, tears streaming down her face as she applauded. He saw his classmates on their feet, Marcus and Ashley and Jordan cheering wildly. He saw his grandmother beaming with pride. But most importantly, he felt his father's hand on his shoulder steady and strong, a reminder that he was loved, that he was valued, that his truth mattered. The auditorium gradually emptied as families filed out into the warm evening, still buzzing with excitement about the performance they'd witnessed. Many lingered hoping to speak with Malcolm Brooks to get autographs to thank him for the incredible concert. Malcolm was gracious with everyone signing programs, posing for photos, answering questions about his career and his music. But his attention kept returning to Elijah, making sure his son was okay, making sure he felt supported and celebrated. Mrs. Henderson approached them as the crowd thinned. She'd been crying again, Elijah could tell, but she held herself together as she waited for a break in the line of well-wishers. "Mr. Brooks." "Elijah," she said quietly. "That was extraordinary. Truly extraordinary." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Malcolm replied politely. "I want you both to know that I've spoken with Principal Morrison. Starting Monday, I'll be implementing some changes in my classroom. I'm going to incorporate more diverse composers into the curriculum. Black composers, Latino composers, Asian composers, women composers. I'm going to make sure my students see that musical excellence comes from all backgrounds." "That's wonderful," Malcolm said, and he sounded genuinely pleased. "Music history has been whitewashed for too long. Students should know about Florence Price and William Grant Still and Chevalier de Saint-Georges. They should understand that classical music has always been more diverse than the standard curriculum suggests. I'd love to have you speak to my classes sometime if you're willing," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Not just about your career, but about your journey, about the obstacles you've overcome. I think it would be incredibly valuable for my students." Malcolm glanced at Elijah, who gave a small nod. "I'd be happy to. When I'm in town between tour dates, we can arrange something." "Thank you." And Elijah. Mrs. Henderson turned to him directly. "I hope you'll continue in music class. I hope you'll share your talent with us. I hope you'll trust me enough to give me a chance to be a better teacher to you." Elijah thought about it for a moment, then said, "I'd like that, Mrs. Henderson." She smiled, grateful and relieved. "Thank you, both of you, for your grace, for your patience, for this incredible gift of music tonight." As she walked away, Marcus and several other classmates crowded around. "Dude, your dad is amazing," Marcus exclaimed. "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen." "You're really good too," Ashley added. That duet was beautiful. For the first time all week, Elijah felt the knot of anxiety in his chest fully release. This, his friends gathered around him, his father standing beside him, the memory of music still echoing in his ears. This was what mattered. Not Mrs. Henderson's initial disbelief, not the humiliation of earlier in the week, but this moment of validation, connection, and joy. Principal Morrison approached with a photographer from the local newspaper. "Mr. Brooks, Would you mind if we took a photo for our school newsletter and possibly for a story in the community section of the paper?" "Of course," Malcolm agreed. "But make sure Elijah is in it too." The photographer positioned them near the piano, father and son together, and captured several images. Malcolm's hand rested on Elijah's shoulder, in every shot a gesture of solidarity and pride. As they finally prepared to leave, walking through the empty auditorium toward the exit, Malcolm spoke quietly to his son. "You know, when I was your age, I faced a lot of what you experienced this week. People who didn't believe I could be serious about classical music teachers who tried to steer me toward other paths, audiences who were surprised when I walked on stage." "How did you handle it?" Elijah asked. "The same way you did." "I told the truth. I worked hard, and I let my music speak for itself. Eventually, the doubters either changed their minds or became irrelevant. The music was bigger than their doubts. They reached the door, stepping out into the cool evening air. Elijah's grandmother had brought the car around. "Dad," Elijah said, "thanks for coming tonight. Thanks for standing up for me." Malcolm pulled his son into a tight hug. "Always, son. Always. I'm proud of you, not because of how you play piano, but because of who you are. Because you stood up for yourself with dignity. Because you told the truth even when it was hard. That's what makes you special." As they drove home through familiar streets past the neighborhood where both Malcolm and Elijah had grown up, Elijah reflected on the week's journey. He'd been hurt, yes. He'd been dismissed and doubted and called a liar. But he'd also stood firm. He'd maintained his dignity. He'd told his truth and waited for it to be proven. And in the end, the truth had proven itself, as it always does. The next day, Saturday, Elijah's phone was flooded with messages. The video someone had recorded of his and Malcolm's duet had gone viral in the local community. The newspaper had already posted an article online about the concert with the headline, "Grammy-nominated pianist Malcolm Brooks performs at Son's Middle School, teaches lesson about assumptions and truth." Mrs. Henderson had texted an article to Principal Morrison, who forwarded it to Elijah's grandmother. It was an op-ed Mrs. Henderson had written for the school's website, titled, "What I Learned from My Student This Week." In it, she detailed the entire incident, without sparing herself, acknowledging her prejudices and biases, apologizing publicly, and committing to do better. It was the kind of accountability that rarely happened, especially from teachers to students. It was honest, vulnerable, and meaningful. Monday morning, when Elijah returned to school, things were different. Not perfect. The memory of being called a liar in front of his class would take time to fully fade, but better. Students greeted him with new respect. Teachers who had heard about the incident went out of their way to engage with him, to ask about his weekend, to treat him with the dignity he'd deserved all along. In music class, Mrs. Henderson welcomed everyone with a different energy. This week, we're starting a new unit on diverse composers in classical music. We'll be learning about musicians who broke barriers and changed the landscape of concert music. And I'd like to start by sharing some recordings of Malcolm Brooks, whose performance Friday night showed us what dedication and talent can achieve. She played a recording of Malcolm performing Rachmaninoff, and Elijah watched his classmates listen with genuine interest. At the end, Mrs. Henderson said, "This is Elijah's father, and Elijah himself is an incredibly talented pianist. I'm hoping he might be willing to perform for us sometime this semester." All eyes turned to Elijah. He felt the familiar nervousness, but also something new: confidence earned through hardship, proven through perseverance. "I'd like that," he said. And he meant it. The story of what happened at Riverside Middle School spread beyond just the local community. It became one of those moments that people shared online, a story about standing up for truth, about the importance of believing students, about the subtle biases that affect how we see and judge others. But for Elijah, it was simpler than all that. It was about a week when he'd been tested, when he'd been hurt, but when he'd also learned something fundamental, that truth doesn't need aggressive defense. It just needs patient, dignified assertion. Truth eventually proves itself, and standing beside the truth, no matter how hard that stance becomes, is always worth it in the end.